Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to continue the backend track from the last tutorial. In the last tutorial, we moved the login and sign up panel that we built in the previous tutorials in JavaScript and CSS and moved it to PHP Slim framework templates. And this is how it looks. Our server is running on localhost 8002. We are using the default development server by PHP, basically by running php-s localhost and the port, our server will come up. And if you watched the previous tutorial, you can see that the document root is in a public within the src folder. So in this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and follow up creating two endpoints in our Slim framework. Plus, we're going to show you how to basically interact with the MySQL database server. So first thing and foremost, we need to download and have the XAMPP bundler. I'm going to show you if you haven't installed it yet, please go ahead and install it, it actually is it's packaging Apache and MariaDB is a new name for MySQL and PHP and Perl. So go ahead and download it for your platform. I'm on Mac, so I downloaded the Mac. And when you download and install it, you're gonna get a executable that is the manager for XAMPP, and it provides you with an interface where you can start and stop Apache Web Server, MySQL database, and Pro FTPD. We don't care about this now, but make sure that these two are running. And from there on, to be able to create a database, we can go to localhost. When you go to the localhost, you're gonna see this page. There's a link phpMyAdmin, which is basically an interface, if you do not know, interface to kind of create databases and tables and schemas. So since we're going to create a flow for signing up and logging in, I'm going to go ahead and create a database here by the name of let's create a database initially. So if I go here, I can create a database. I will call it Slim Crash Course and press on create. Now what it asks is that there's no table, obviously. So we're going to create a table with the name users. We want to set the numbers of columns to 3 and press OK. So you can see that we can define 3 columns. The first one is going to be uh, the ID. So we have a field called ID. The type is int. The length I'm going to say 11. I want to make sure that it is auto-incremented. And when we say auto-incremented, it needs to define it needs to add an index saying that this is our primary key. So go ahead and press OK here. So now we are all good here. The second thing is based on our interface, we have a username and password. So I'm going to create a username field. Make sure that this is varchar and the size I'm going to say 255. And the second one is going to be the password. Same thing, varchar and 255. So if I press save now, you'll see that we have a table called users under a Slim Crash Course, and it includes an ID, username, and password. So now that we have our database set up and our table set up, there are different ways in PHP that you can connect and use this. For example, for uh, those of you who are familiar with Laravel, which is another very nice framework for PHP, you know that there is a Eloquent module that you can use. Basically, the Eloquent ORM included with Laravel provides beautiful, simple active record implementation. So you can go ahead and define models and all that. But today, I'm going to show you a simpler way. There is another library called Redbean PHP. So I'm just going to go to the Google and search Redbean PHP. And the good thing with Redbean is that it's an easy to use ORM as well for PHP. So ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping. And the good thing about it is that it's zero config ORM that automatically builds your database schema. So let's go ahead and download it. So in the download section, you can see that there are different downloads for MySQL, Postgres database, and SQLite. So we want to download the MySQL version. So when we download it, I'm going to, it's a zip file. You can basically untar it or unzip it. You can see there is only one file here called RB mysql.php. So what I can do is that I can copy this file. Let's do it from the command line. I'm going to stop the server. So here I am right now in Slim Crash Course SRC public. So I go one level up. Then I'm just going to copy the file that we just downloaded. So it is redbean.mysql, and then we have the RB MySQL, and I'm just going to copy it here. So now you can see that along the composer.json and composer.far, we have rb.mysql as well. For the simplicity, I'm going to just rename it to RB. So let's say RB MySQL. So now you can see that we have a file called RB MySQL. I'm just going to go ahead. Sorry, I have to actually add the extension to it. So I'm going to rename this to RB MySQL dot PHP. Let's see, what am I doing wrong here? So there you go. So now we have our rb.mysql .php. So actually, I don't like this name. Let's make it, because I know it's MySQL anyways. So I'm just going to say rb.php. So now we have rb.php here. What I need to do, going back to our code, you can see that we have the index.php that we developed previously. And the only thing I need to do is just to require and say, I want rb.php, right? And rb.php is right now in the root. I'm just going to go ahead and move it in the src directory. It was actually in src. So this is the reference to our rb.php. Now the rb.php is included in our project. The next thing I want to do, I'm going to the website, and there is a sort of a documentation on how to create a connection. So apart from requiring the RB, we need to set it up. And it's actually pretty easy. I'm just going to copy this and paste it beneath the require that we have. And what it says is that we want to set up the R, the red beans, and then it asks for MySQL host, localhost. I'm just going to say 120.771, which points to our localhost. And then the database, we called it Slim Crash Course. The username by default when you install XAMPP is root, and there is no password for it. So this is the simplest and easiest config for RB or Redbean PHP to be set up. Now we need two endpoints. The first endpoint is going to be, I'm going to create a post because we're going to post the data for logging in and signing up. So I'm going to create a slash login endpoint, and then the second parameter will be a function that has request and response. We can go ahead and pass arg here as well, but since we don't use any of that here, I'm just going to omit that. And now we want to say have the same thing for sign up, right? So now, how are we going to sign up? And that would be the initial thing. If I go to the interface that we created over here, we have the login and sign up. Sign up has a username and password and confirm password. So we have fields like username and password that we need to send to the endpoint of sign up to be able to save them to the database, right? So I'm going back to the code. We have put the markup for our page in index.html. So we have a login section and we have a sign up section. I'm going to give these inputs IDs. So for the input username, I'm just going to say login username as ID. And for the password, I'm just going to give it an ID of login and then password, right? The same thing I'm going to do for the sign up section. So I'm going for the input and type ID. I want it to be sign up uh, username. And then for the password, I can give it sign up password. And then we have a confirm password. I'm just going to go ahead and give it sign up password and then confirm. So now we can create references to these inputs from our JavaScript. The next thing I want to do is I also want to give an ID to the login button. So basically this, and then the sign up. So I'm just going to create an ID. I'm just going to call it login and then btn. And also for the sign up, I'm going to create an ID with sign up btn, right? So now that we assign the IDs, you can go ahead and also add classes. We'll make sure that the classes or IDs are unique, the name of them based on what you're using, like input login.username. Don't go ahead and create username here and also username for this, since we have both of the panels on the same file or the same page. So it's important that these IDs are unique. That's why I prefix the names with login here and sign up here for the username in the sign up. So now that we have these, what am I going to do is I'm going to create in the index.php here, I can assume that I have a username that I will get passed from the front end. So I'm just going to say request get param. That's how you get the parameter. So I'm just going to say username. And then I will just copy these and say password as well. So I'm just going to get a password from the front end as well. And I know that I need these also for the sign up, right? The next thing I want to do is basically knowing these values. I want to insert them in the database in the users table that we created. So now if I go back to the Red Bean PHP, in the tutorial section, there are different things that you can go ahead and see. One of these is actually CRUD. And here you can see that how, we can this basically shows how to create a record in the table. So basically it says let's create a record for book and then give it a title and a rating. But what we're gonna do is instead we're gonna in the sign up we're gonna say R dispense, and we know that the table's name is users. So I'm just gonna create a variable user. Then I'm gonna say user dot username equals to the username that we get as a parameter. And for the password, I can do user dot password arrow password. I can pass the password, right? And lastly, we need to actually say R store the user, right? As easy as that. But now the thing is that we don't want to store the password as a plain text. So we don't want to store, we want it to be more secure. So we don't want to see or the administrator, as an administrator, we don't want to see what's the password of users, right? So to be able to handle that, PHP has a function called password hash. So now you can see that it expects a password and then also the algorithm. And for the algorithm, we're going to just say default or password default, right? As a default password. So this basically creates a hash out of the password and assigns it to the user, and then we're going to store it, right? And finally, we need to return something to the front end or whoever is the user of this endpoint. So what I can do is I can say response with JSON. So we're going to return JSON, and I'm going to create an array. And here I just say status, and then I would just say OK, right? Or instead of OK, we can say status true, right? So basically, we created a user record. We said its username is the username that we get as the parameter, and the password, we're going to hash the password, and then we uh, put it in the password field of the user, and then we basically store it. So if you are not familiar with this syntax, when you include the red bin PHP, it exposes R, which is a class, as a global variable. And then you can use these static functions like, for example, dispense or store to be able to do stuff with the red bin PHP, right? So now, the next thing I want you to know is that we want to try to see if this actually works, right? So right now, if I go to phpMyAdmin, localhost phpMyAdmin, in the Slim crash course database, in the users table, there's nothing. There's really nothing, right? So now, the next thing I want you to know, if you already don't know it, there is a tool called Postman. So I search it in the Google. You can see the Postman API development environment. So one of the products that they have is called Postman, and it depends on obviously what platform you're in. So if you go to the product section and click on Postman and scroll all the way down, you see this compare plans. And then here they have a plan that is actually free, so you don't need to pay anything. And then you can download their app. And there, when you download it and install it, you're going to see something like this. And this is very good for sort of testing the APIs that you develop locally, but also you can test it for the APIs and endpoints in the internet. So now that I know that in my Slim Framework project, I created this sign up endpoint that uses post, I can go ahead and try it. So here, let me see if our server is on. It is not. So I'm going to public and then write php -s and then localhost 8002. So it starts our local environment. Now I'm opening the Postman. Here I know that the method is get. It's actually not get, it's post. So I'm just going to change it to post. And the URL is going to be http localhost 8002 slash and this endpoint that we have created here. So I'm just going to post it here. The next thing we want to do is sending two parameters, username and password. So here in the body, I'm going to say it's form data, and then I just create username, let's say frontend tips, and then the password, key password, I'm just going to say password for the value, right? Now if I press send, you'll see that we actually didn't get anything. The reason is that when we do response with JSON, we actually need to return it, right? So it basically returned nothing. But the good news is that if we go to a phpMyAdmin, which is here, now if I click on users, you'll see that it actually created a record with username frontend tips, and the password is the hash that we created using the hash password method, right? So far so good. So the next thing I want to do, if I go back to the code and the sign up, one thing we want to do is that we don't want to recreate the users with the same username, right? So what we need to do is we need to check if, I'm just going to put a comment here, if username exists, return false, for example, right? As a starter. Otherwise, go ahead and create the user and save it in the database. So what am I going to do is if I go to the Red Bin PHP website and go to finding, because we want to find if a user is there, it actually gives us the syntax that we want to use to be able to find something. And one of the queries we can do is find one. So we want to see if there is one record corresponding to the user in the database. So what I can do, I'm just going to copy this for now, going back here, and I will just paste it here. We know that our database, our table name is users. We are interested in the username field, and in this array, what we want to pass is the field or the parameter that we got from the front end or from, whoever calls this endpoint. So now I'm going to put it in a variable called user, and then I'm going to check it. If user is not equal to null, so basically this find one, if it can't find the user with the username that we are passing in the database, it returns null. So if the user is actually null, it means that that user doesn't exist. And I'm going to copy all this code and paste it over here, right? So it goes ahead and creates the user. Otherwise, I want to return the same response, but instead say status false, right? So basically, as of now, our convention is that if we could create a user, we just return status true. And if we couldn't, we return status false, right? So now if I go ahead and try to create the same user, so I'm opening Postman, I'm already having this sign up. We have the username, front end, tips, and password. So now if I send, you will see that I get status false because the user already exists. And if we go to the PHP My Admin over here, if I press this, you'll see that it doesn't even create a new user. So now to test, to see if it works, I'm just going to change front end tips to maybe Kotus. Let's call it with the same password. So if I press send, now you'll see that we get status true. And if I go to PHP My Admin and click here, you'll see that it also created that username, which is perfect. So now what we're going to do is we want to also create the flow for logging in. So for login, we get the parameters username and password here as well. And then we can easily use the same find one method over here. So I'm just going to paste it over here. So yes, if we have a users with this username, so if user is not null, it means that it found a record with that username in the users table. Now we want to check if the password is the same as the one that we have in the database. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say if. Now, we used password hash to create a hash out of the password that we get as a parameter. The other now how to basically use that, we can do verify password. It's another handy PHP. Sorry, not verify password, but password verify. And now if I show you what it has, basically it says you just send the password first, and also it needs the hash that we stored in the database. So the first parameter will be the password that we got as a parameter. And then the second one will be the password that we get from the database, right? Like that. So if this holds true, so this returns true if this can, this password is having is pass this password that we stored in the database is the hash of this password. So if it's true, it means that the user can log in. So we can just return response with JSON, and we can create an array and say status okay or true for that matter. Otherwise, we can go ahead and return the same thing but false. Now here, this piece of code within user not null only holds if it found a user with that username. Otherwise, we can go ahead and also return status false. Later on in the tutorials, we're gonna basically modify these to make it more readable. So we will send better responses that we can handle in front end, in the code, in the JavaScript and HTML, and show the appropriate message. But for now, this is good. So now I'm going to go ahead and see, let's see what is this, because I need to use curly brackets. So now what I can do, I can use Postman, and instead of sign up, I can choose the login because we are using the login endpoint. It gets the same parameters, and it's a good thing with Postman is that we already have the keys and values over here. So I expect that when I press send, because this user is already saved in our database. So if I press send, you'll see that we get status true. Now if I choose a different password, let's say password 1, and press send, we're gonna get status false. Also, if I choose a different user, let's say Kotus2, which is not in the database, we are gonna get status false as well. So forth, we have created the login so far. We have created the login and sign up endpoints. And now it's time to work on the front end section a little bit, which is this one. So we want to show that we can sign up the user, basically fill in this form and sign up, and it creates a record in the database. Also, we're going to try to see if we can use login and get the status OK from the endpoints. So we already went ahead and assigned in the index.html, we assigned the IDs here. Now I'm going to our script main.js and create references to those IDs. So first things first, I can say login username. It's a document query selector, and I know that we called it login username. Same thing we're gonna do for login password. So login password is login password. I'm going to copy both of these, paste it here. We had sign up. So sign up username and sign up password, and this was sign up, and this was password. Sorry, sign up as well. So these are the references to the input fields that we have both in the sign up and the login section. We also need to have two references to the buttons that we created, right? So if I go to the index.html, you can see that for the login button, we have the ID login btn, and for the other one, we have sign up btn. So going back to the JavaScript section, we can create const login btn is document.query selector, and then I can say ID login btn, and copying this, pasting it, we're gonna do it for the sign up, right? So now I'm just gonna say sign up here as well. Now the idea is that we're gonna start with sign up. So when we click on this, we want to get these two fields and then send it to the API that we created for signing up. To be able to do that, what am I going to do is add an event listener to sign up btn, add event listener, click, and then the second parameter is going to be a function. And then what we want to do now, we want to send requests to the endpoints. I'm going to use the JavaScript Fetch API that we talked about in previous tutorials. So I'm going to go to the Google Fetch API, scrolling all the way down. We can see that there's a link using fetch. And one of the examples down here is how to post the data. And since in our project, if I go to the index.php, you can see that the method for this login endpoint and sign up instead of get is post, obviously, because we're sending data. I'm going to use this. So I'm going to copy both of these, going to my JavaScript in the main.js, and then I'm going to basically copy this down here. Okay. One thing I noticed right now, which is interesting, is that when we did the front end, we created the two variables login.btn and signup.btn, and those were referring to these tabs over here, login and signup. So I need to go ahead and rename these, right? So maybe instead of login btn, I can say login panel and then sign up panel, and then here I can do sign up panel and login panel. So we do not collide with these two new variables that we created for this. So if I save this now, if I save this code and refresh, you'll see that this still works, but we need to make sure that we do this right. So we rename this to login panel. So this will be login panel, and this is going to be sign up panel, and this one will be login panel as well. So login panel and sign up panel. So you can see that it starts working the way we expected it. I just basically renamed that login BTN and sign up BTN for these two sort of, you know, um, let's say buttons or whatever you want to call it. I just renamed them to panel. And then I changed the references in this piece of code to handle this effect over here so that it works correct. So now, going back to the post data is a method that calls and returns the fetch API. In the fetch API, we pass the URL, and then there are a bunch of things that we want to go through. But for now, let's just create just basically call this function. So I'm going to copy this because this is how you call it. So I'm just going to say call the post data function, pass the URL, and then the data that you want to send. And then obviously you receive the data. And also if you get an error, you can catch the error. Since we don't return any error at the moment, I'm just going to remove that. So now we want to make our data. So to be able to make the data, if I go to Postman, you can see that we have used form data. So we are not sending any JSON or JavaScript objects. It's literally form data. So to be able to use form data in front end, what we need to do is I'm just going to create a variable const, let's say form data, new form data. We basically create an instance of the form data class. And then I can do not form date, but data. And then I can do form data.append, and then obviously we're going to pass a username, and this username will be the login username value. So login username value. And then the same thing holds for the password. So I'm just going to do password, and this is going to be login password, that value. And instead of this object, that was the example, we're going to just send form data, right? As easy as that. So what happens literally is that when we click on the sign up BTN in our front end here, it will basically get the values of these two. Just dismiss the confirm password. We're going to deal with it later. But for now, just to show you the functionality works, we're going to get the value of these. And then we post it. We need to post it to this address and then sign up. So now going back to the code in our JavaScript, we need to just change this to sign up, right? We don't need to obviously enter the whole address, HTTP localhost, blah, 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 because both our interface page and the API are on the same address and port, right? So I'm just going to say sign up and then passing the form data, and then we get the data from the backend and we basically log it in the console. So this is for the sign up. We can just copy this, paste it over here, and we have the login btn, and it's pretty much the same. The only difference is that, okay, so I have to basically change this to sign up btn, because we are in the sign up section, and then this one is correct. So login, when we click on login, we get the values, we create a form data, and then we post that data and see what happens next, right? So now coming to the post data, we have the URL and the data. So what I want to do, the method post, all good. Mode course, no problem. Credentials, same origin. We are on the same origin, both in the here in the JavaScript because it gets loaded through the same origin. And then I can go ahead and remove the header. I don't need that. Redirect, follow, we can just leave them. But the important thing is that we need to change the body from JSON stringify to only this data. So we don't need the JSON stringify because we are not sending JSON data. We are using the form data. So we just assign that, which is the second parameter here. So I can go ahead and remove these default values for now, since we didn't talk about them. So now for the post data, we send the URL and data. So the URL is going to be sign up for when we click on the sign up btn, and it's going to be login for when we create the login. So going back to the main and then change it to login, right? So we have created the handlers when we click on the sign up btn and login btn. So now going back here, I'm going to open the Chrome inspector so that we can see the results. Now for the sign up, I'm going to say front-end tips, and then I'm going to give it a password, and then password. But the important thing is that we already created a user, if you remember, with front-end tips. So in the network tab, just to show you how it works, if I click sign up, we actually got an error. Let's see why. It says form data is not defined. So let's see why. And the line that it argues is 48 in the main.js. So it's talking about this. The reason is that the class name is actually starting with capital F. So now this should work. So now if I refresh the page, sign up, front end tips, and then I'm typing password, and then sign up. You can see that we actually get the response status false, which is the expected value because we already have a user front end tips. So in the network tab, if I show you the sign up call here, if I go to the headers, you can see that it basically called localhost 8002 sign up, and it also sent two form data, username and password, that we capture in the index.php using getParam username and password, right? And now we can create, for example, a new user like frontend tips 1 with the same password and then sign up. If I go to the console, if I sign up, now you can see that the status is true. And if I go to the PHP My Admin, you can see that it actually created the frontend tips 1 as well. So now let's see if the login works correctly. So going back to the login, I'm just going to say frontend tips that we created before, and then I know that the password I entered was password. So when I press login, we get status true, meaning that it found the user. Now if I choose another password and press login, you can see that we get status false. And it literally does the calls in the network tab, right? All right, so far so good. The next step is that let's create an endpoint called user. So app get user, and then the second parameter is a function that accepts request and response. And then within that, what I want to do is, let's say this endpoint is protected. So this endpoint will be accessible only if the user is logged in, right? So for the starter, I can go ahead and say, just return the response, and then with status 403 or 401, if I'm not wrong. 401 basically stands for unauthorized, right? So this endpoint, or this endpoint in your website, or this path in your website is actually protected. So if I save this, I need to put the semicolon here. If I go ahead here and type /user, what we're gonna get is basically, let's see what it says, 200 okay. Let's see why. So we do get return response with status code 401. So now you can see that it actually says this page isn't working. Uh, Let me just go ahead here and see why. I think it actually shows it pretty fast, but the reason being is that um, let's remove this and say with JSON array message, for example, you are not authorized, right? So if I do this now, um, let's see what I get. Let's just say return response. Now you can see that we get MSG, you are not authorized, right? So what we did was that this endpoint or this path in your website needs the user to be authorized. So we basically returned the response. We gave it a status 401, which stands for unauthorized, and then we passed this JSON that has this message, right? You can go ahead and also use write and send like just a user you are not authorized, just to make it a little bit nicer. So you're not authorized, right? So now what we're going to do is when we log in, assuming that the password verify worked and we return OK, we want to put the username inside a session. So I would just session, PHP session, simply username equals to the username that we got, right? Obviously, to make this work, in the beginning of our code, we need to call session start. So the session start method so that it starts the session handling. And then here, if the password verify in our login worked, we just put the username inside the session, right? So now, if I come back in the endpoint that we created user, I can easily check if session and then username exists, we want to return response with status code 200, which means okay, and you can say welcome back, right? Otherwise, we want to return the response with status code 401, which is unauthorized, and then we say this, right? So now if I go back here, if I refresh, we're gonna see still you're not authorized. We'll go to the main page and try to log in. So front end tips and then password and then log in, status true. Now if I hit the user endpoint, you'll see that it says welcome back. The reason being that when we logged in the login handler over here, when we verified that the username exists, the user with that username exists, and the password actually is correct, we just put that username in the session. And then in our user endpoint, which is a protected endpoint or a protected path in our page, we basically check if that session username exists. We just say welcome back. Otherwise, we say 401. Great. So I'm actually running out of battery right now, and this was almost the end of this episode. So I hope you enjoyed this episode for now. We created two endpoints, sign up and log in, and we also showed how we can utilize session to make sure that the user is logged in. In the next tutorial, what we're going to do is that we're going to work a little bit on the front end side of this. We're going to make sure, depending on the status that we get, we show the corresponding correct message. And then later on, we go ahead and create an admin dashboard that basically expects the user to be logged in, and we can, add some form for saving the personal information and so on and so forth. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do and press the bell icon to be notified for the next tutorial, which we're going to enhance this a little bit more. And then ultimately, in the tutorial after that, we're going to have an end-to-end username and login and sign up panel that talks to the database, stores the data, and retrieves the data, and also uh, basically redirects to the dashboard or admin dashboard that we're going to have. So I wish you a great day and night, and see you next time. Goodbye.